Das Radical.
Police brutality is an unfortunate side product that exists in every society that has some sort of an agency maintaining law and order, sometimes via use of force. However, in this video we're not going to talk about that. Not a lot. In this video I'm going to tell you the true story of how the police in Reykjavik was once almost entirely overpowered by an angry mob during a famous riot which took place in 1932. Enjoy! Reykjavik during the early 1930s was a far different place from what it is now. A large portion of the town's 30,000 residents lived in severe poverty. Often entire families lived cramped together in tiny cellars or apartments. Icelandic workers had only recently started to form unions, but securing basic workers' rights had been a very slow and tedious process. Company owners and business leaders were still able to dictate wages and work hours almost entirely at their own discretion. By 1932, the Great Depression had made a severe impact onto Iceland's economy, and an ever-growing portion of Reykjavik's population found itself without work. To help alleviate the situation, the city administration set up the so-called unemployment benefit work program, known in Icelandic as atvinnubótavinnan. The program was designed to help alleviate the situation by giving some of the worst financially off male citizens working for the city doing minor trivial tasks like breaking down rocks in order for them to be later used in road construction or sanitizing the Reykjavik city pond. However, the program was to start up in September of that year, but the city administration kept delaying implementing the program, stating that the city funds simply weren't enough for the program to go ahead unless they would cut the wages of said program by almost 30%. It should be noted that the pay which had already been decided upon was already quite below what we might consider minimum wage today. This was of course a very popular decision supported by a majority of the city's residents. Back in those days, the Reykjavik city administration held 15 seats. And out of those 15 seats, the newly united Icelandic right wing, the Independence Party, held a full majority of 8 seats. Whereas the Commons People Party held 5 seats and the centrist Agrarian Progressive Party had 2. It is, by the way, very noteworthy that out of these 15 council members, 2 would later become Prime Minister of Iceland. They were Stefán Jóhann Stefánsson and Hermann Jónasson. And another member of the city council at the time, Einar Arnórsson, had once been Minister of Iceland, back in the time when Iceland was still a realm of the Kingdom of Denmark. On November 9th, 1932, the city administration held an open meeting at the Good Templar House next to the Icelandic Parliament building. On this meeting, the fate of the unemployment benefit work program was to be discussed, as were the proposed pay cuts. Reykjavik's poor and unemployed were of course by now very much fed up by the desperate work situation, and they showed up to the house in droves in order to protest. It should also be noted that both the Icelandic Communist Party and the Social Democrats had pleaded to their members for as many of them to show up as possible so that they could not only protest but hopefully force the city administration into, instead of cutting the pay of the program, that they would instead expand it and allow even more people to work for the city. At the time, the unemployment benefit work program was only intended to employ around 150 people, which did not exactly help which basically only held like 10% of Reykjavik's entire unemployed population. It is estimated that more than 1,000 citizens showed up at the Good Templar house in order to protest the city administration. The police allowed as many people into the building as the main hall would take before closing off the main entrance and standing guard at the door. The Reykjavik Police Commissioner, who just happened to also be Hermann Jónasson, feared that if the protesters got too violent, that they might easily be able to overpower his force of only 12 officers, who were, by the way, only armed with clubs. Also, among the protesters there were several Icelandic communists and socialists who would later in life set their mark on the Icelandic political scene. Héðinn Valdimarsson, Einar Olgeirsson, Brynjólfur Bjarnason, just to name a few. Now, despite the severe protests going on both outside and inside of the building, the city council members were eventually able to have a lunch break and get out of the building and away from the protests without incident. During the lunch break, Hermann got busy and ordered the remainder of his entire police force to come down to the Good Templar house, and he made most of them stay out of sight, hidden in the basement. Including Hermann himself, there were now 29 policemen at the scene, the entire Reykjavik city police force. As the meeting continued at around 3 p.m., the protesters inside the hall started to get more and more unruly and loud, making it almost impossible for the council members to negotiate. And soon they also started to get very nervous when they noticed that the spectators had started to break apart the wooden furniture, most likely in order to use the broken pieces as clubs. Noticing the fear that was starting to take over among the council members, Hermann turned to Pétur Halldórsson and urged him to make a compromise, that is, decide to not lower any wages and let the atvinnubótavinna continue as had been planned. Pétur, on the other hand, replied that he was not willing to make any compromises except if Hermann could guarantee the council's safety and that they could all get home alive and well. Hermann agreed. Now, a small heads up, at this point a lot of things started to happen all at once, so the description of events does get a little bit chaotic from now on. In somewhat of a panic, the city council decided suddenly to break off the meeting, believing that the situation had become too volatile for them to continue. However, this only served to anger the protesters even more. Many of them tried to break through the police barricade situated between the hall and the stage where the city council was seated. 3 of the protesters managed to break through the police barricades. They jumped onto the stage where they were then greeted by Hermann himself. By the way, it is at this point that we need to note that Hermann, aside from being police commissioner, was also the former wrestling champion of Iceland, and at that point he was just 35 years old and still in a very good physical shape. He threw the 3 men off the stage just as quickly as they jumped onto it. Right after that, Hermann ordered his men to disperse the crowd with a quick assault. The protesters did not expect there to be more policemen hiding backstage, so when a force of around 16 officers jumped forth, swinging their batons around, most of the protesters quickly dispersed and fled. Some of them tried to resist and were able to inflict several minor wounds onto the officers. However, overall it is safe to assume that the protesters suffered much heavier losses. Most of them simply fled, with Hermann coming closely behind his officers, ordering them around in the style of a military officer. One of the protesters managed to elude the police and get behind them. He then ran up to Hermann and gave him a single blow in the head, resulting in Hermann losing his footing temporarily. However, Hermann was then able to turn around and knock the man out with a single blow. And this courageous man was none other than Brynjólfur Bjarnason. Meanwhile, a posse of around 6 police officers were able to escort the city council members safely through a back exit where there were only very few protesters gathered. However, some of the protesters threw rocks at the city council members, but they only sustained minor injuries. However, as more protesters closed in, the 3 remaining council members decided to stay in the building and wait there until all was over. The police had now managed to take back control of the house and throw all of the protesters out the door. However, they quickly realized that if the protesters were to attempt to force themselves back inside, the police and the 3 councilmen would have no course of escape and would most likely be utterly overpowered. So, Hermann made the fateful decision to try and break out of the siege. Hermann's police force now weighed their way out of the house. Hermann pleaded to the crowd to let them through. However, when the protesters showed no sign of letting them, Hermann then ordered his force to run into the crowd, swinging their batons around them in order to attempt to disperse the protesters. However, once inside the crowd, the police officers quickly lost track of each other, and eventually the force got completely dispersed. Most of the officers received injuries, some of them very severe. Some officers were completely overpowered and incapacitated. Now, of course, many of the protesters also received injuries. However, it is not known exactly how many of them or how severe such injuries may have been. It is not known since many of them opted to not seek medical attention afterwards. Now, my personal guess is many of the protesters simply didn't want to risk getting prosecuted, but this is just a guess on my part. Now, Hermann was eventually able to make it back to the police station, having received only minor injuries. Now, some historians believe that the communists may have deliberately allowed Hermann to get out of the riot, because Hermann was also the acting city local court judge, and he was supposed to perform his duties as such later that afternoon. Now, why would the communists want Hermann to make it to that appointment? Well, it just so happened that on that very day, the acting Minister of Justice for Iceland, Magnús Guðmundsson, who had recently been charged for fraud, was supposed to get sentenced by Hermann. I guess you might consider this the mother of great timings. Hermann waited at the police station for a while until several of his men were able to make it there. The rest by that point had already been moved to the hospital or were on their way there. Hermann then ordered his men, those who were still able to walk, to go to every store in Reykjavik and confiscate all firearms and ammunition. You see, Hermann did not want to give the communists any opportunities to attempt a complete takeover now that the city had been rendered almost entirely defenseless. Later that day, Hermann found Magnús Guðmundsson guilty of fraud and sentenced him to 15 days in prison. He was later acquitted by the Supreme Court of Iceland. After the riots of November 9th, things turned back to normal pretty quickly. The communists never attempted a full-scale takeover of the city, and the city administration never again attempted to lower any wages. On that afternoon, a total of 21 police officers out of a grand total of just 28 had to be hospitalized. However, many of them returned to work just several days after the riots. However, some returned to work still in a pretty bad shape after the fight. Several, however, never recovered from their injuries and had to leave work entirely. After the riots of 1932, efforts were made by the Icelandic government to greatly strengthen the power of Iceland's police. More men were hired, and also the police was allowed to obtain better equipment like tear gas and eventually also firearms. Now, I hope you liked the video, and if you did, well, please share it and have a nice day. By now, the police had managed... fucking construction. I hope you don't hear that.
Das Rate Karl.